What's up, everybody? How are you? I hope that you had a
Oh,
wonderful
professor.
break and that you're feeling rested and ready to get back to it. We're going to talk about a new topic today, which is especially interesting, and it's the topic of women's empowerment and gender equality. I almost said inequality, but that's part of the story in many places. We'll see gender empowerment and women's equality and gender equality in new democracies. And we're going to talk about this by thinking about different legal reforms and institutions that help to promote women's empowerment. Before we do that, we'll try to conceptualize women's empowerment and talk about what that means and what we are looking for out in the world when we look for women's empowerment. Now, before we get started, we've got to deal with some housekeeping. Um, First and foremost, virtually all of the exams have been graded, and the reader has sent me the grades, and I'm going to be uploading those within the next day. So, as always, thank you for being patient. I'm excited about how they turned out, and I look forward to talking with you about that more going forward. Secondarily, we don't have a final exam in this course. It was brought to my attention that for whatever reason, the university did not schedule a final exam slot for this course. This decision was made before I was hired last April, and no one told me about it. I have no idea why. I don't know what reasoning was behind this decision. The first time I've ever seen this. I've taught at multiple institutions. Why it wasn't my choice whether or not a final exam would be administered is beyond me. But this is the situation we're in. And so, what I propose and what I plan to do is I am going to put together what is essentially kind of like a final exam. You can complete it for extra credit. And it's going to be due on basically the Friday of finals week. That gives you a week after the due date of the paper, which is due December 11th. And what I'm going to do is just give you an opportunity to complete it for extra credit. That will give us a reason to continue to complete the course, and it will give you some added support if you're at all concerned about your grade. I think this is fair because I can't give you a new assignment. That wouldn't be fair. But I can give you something that would use your knowledge from the rest of the course and would give you a chance to get a step up. So what we'll do is we'll reproportion the three. So what we'll do is we'll take the three assignments that we've completed so far, or the three that we have, and we'll reapportion them so that they make up the full 100% of the grade. And I'll just do it proportionally so that I don't reweight any of the components. And then in addition, I'll give you that chance for that extra credit, and I'll be generous with the extra credit. So I'll have more information about this as we go forward. I'll talk more about it on Wednesday. But I just ask that, yet again, you just kind of, run with me here. I'm a little disappointed, to say the very least, that the university did this, but apparently it's a thing. So does anyone have any comments or questions about this?
So for our first exam, what was around the average performance? Because I know for a while I was kind of concerned to wonder how I did for the midterm. And for the take home, will it be cumulative or will it just be on like the stuff that we will be learning after that point?
Just the second half. Yeah. So it's not cumulative, just the second half. But the average was about an 84, 85, about the mean grade, which, I think is good. I think that's a good mean. And I want you to keep in mind that the midterm is usually going to be a little lower than the grades that come after it. And the reason is because it's the first assignment and there's always sort of a graduation, so to speak. And more generally, I want you all to feel optimistic about the class, because these are strange circumstances, and the last thing I'm trying to do is penalize any of you. And so I want to be as supportive as possible. And for me, what really matters is completing the course and doing so in a way that gets you the credit, and just kind of getting through this. And I want you to do your best, but I think that when survival is the main priority, we have to think a little differently about the way we do this. So, yeah. Jocelyn says, wow, yikes. I know, right? Um, I've taught at several institutions and I've never seen anything like this. A lot of thank yous. Julisse is crying. um, uh, yeah, that's right, Arturo. It'll count towards extra credit. And does not having a final affect me? Karen asks. Yeah, I have to be honest. I'm disappointed because I wanted to be able to give you a final assignment that was fair and that would gauge your performance. And the course is so important, like the content and the substance of the class matters so much that it would be useful to have it. But honestly, I'm so proud of you all for doing so well in the course and always being engaged that that's what matters the most to me. So I think we can still accomplish what we set out to do despite not having that. Does it affect my job? No, it doesn't. It doesn't affect my job. It's my class. I'm my own boss. That's one of the best things about being a college instructor or a professor. You are your own boss, with some exceptions, but you call the shots. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. Great. Okay, well, I look forward to engaging you in making the most of the rest of this semester. You're all so chill about this that I really feel quite relieved, to be honest. I was a little nervous about telling you, but I think I was overthinking it. Okay, so gender equality and women's empowerment. This is such an important topic because, the truth is, transitions to democracy usually disproportionately negatively affect women. It's kind of like, oh, the men are in charge of this transition. They'll figure out what to do and what the political regime will look like. In fact, in most Latin American countries, in the early years after the transitions to democracy, there were only 4 or 5, 6% of legislatures that were held by women. So very small proportions of legislative constituencies were represented by women. And what that meant then is that the politics in Latin American countries were from the very beginning somewhat masculine, if you will, and they didn't often take into consideration women's points of view and issues that affect women in particular, like reproductive rights and access to health services that women need. And so when we talk about women in democracy, we're talking primarily about representation. We're talking primarily about promoting the representation of women in legislatures, in executives, in institutions of government that we associate with democracy. And women's empowerment then takes the form of representation and agenda setting and accounting for women's interests and thinking about the whole set of issues that affect women in particular, in addition to those issues that affect everyone. When you think about gender equality and women's empowerment, you often think about protest movements, and sometimes you think about feminism, or you think about women mobilizing to protest some injustice or to demand some set of rights that they don't enjoy. Oftentimes in Latin American countries in particular, those rights are reproductive rights. And you see images like this of women exhausted from engaging in this continuous struggle to obtain basic rights and liberties that are enjoyed by women elsewhere in the world. And new democracies in particular often have a long way to go when it comes to expanding women's rights and representation, changing the composition of institutions of government like legislatures, getting women into positions of power. This is an image from Latin America, and it gives you a sense of that fatigue and that exhaustion that often goes into this battle to obtain these rights. In Argentina, that battle has been especially vivid. This is a picture from August 9th, 2018, in the aftermath of the Senate's rejection of a bill to legalize abortion. They deliberated for 16 hours, and it was a huge national issue. In the end, the Senate rejected that bill, and you saw images like this. This really shows you the investment in that campaign to obtain reproductive rights, the struggle, the time, the energy. This is the face of these kinds of movements, the movement for gender equality, expanding women's rights in places that historically haven't promoted those rights. Argentina is just one example. There are other examples throughout the world, but in Latin America and in Argentina, there has been some important progress when it comes to the representation of women and getting women in positions of power. And Latin America is actually noteworthy because they've had a lot of women presidents. And so here on the left, we have Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who was the Argentine president from 2007 to 2015. We have Michelle Bachelet, who was the president of Chile from 2006 to 2010 and 2014 to 2018, and Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, who was president from 2011 to 2016. These three women were very, very notable for their promotion of women's rights issues and for their insistence on expanding women's rights, expanding women's representation, some more than others. Michelle Bachelet was especially aggressive, perhaps more so than Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, but they were all important in their own right because they represented advances in gender equality in Latin America and really the world over. Now, what's interesting is Michelle Bachelet was also the defense minister in Chile for 6 years, from 2000 to 2006. And she was an important figure at that time because of her role in putting together a lot of reforms that would eventually be approved a half decade later. When I was in Chile, I actually had an interview lined up with Michelle Bachelet about one of her reforms during her presidency. And it was all set to take place. And her team backed out because they, I think, read the list of questions in the letter that I wrote them and didn't want to talk to me because I discovered later that she was on the wrong side of the issue. But the point is that Michelle Bachelet is an important figure and represents some of the advances in gender equality. When I was in Argentina, I actually went to an asado on the rooftop of the apartment building that Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner lived in. And it was interesting, like a week earlier, the federal police had raided her apartment as part of a corruption sting. So, yeah, interesting, really interesting. But for our purposes, these women are especially noteworthy because they ascended to the very top of political power in their respective countries. And when we think about their ascension, when we think about empowerment and equality, we really want to think about four key questions and four key sets of issues that we'll deal with today and Wednesday. And first, what is women's empowerment? So we're going to conceptualize women's empowerment and think about what we mean by that and how we know we see it when we see it, and what gender equality is and how it relates to women's empowerment. We'll begin to look more closely at democracy, and we'll talk about legal reforms that have contributed to women's empowerment in democracies, in particular quotas and different rules about how many women must be in different legislative bodies and so on. Third, why do some countries or some democracies go further to empower women than do other democracies? This is an important question because, as many of you know from research that you're doing or that you're interested in doing, countries don't all go as far when it comes to promoting women's rights. Some countries like Uruguay go much further. Countries like Honduras don't go very far at all. And so these differences matter because there's something systematic that differentiates those experiences. And so we want to know why some democracies go further than others. And then finally, we'll examine some different experiences. We'll do some case studies of women's empowerment and gender equality. We're going to start in the broadest possible way. And what I want to do is just kind of sit back and talk about what we mean by women's empowerment. How do we know that we've seen women's empowerment when we see it? If we were to look out at the world, what would we look for? What do we mean by women's empowerment? What do we mean by gender equality? What is a gender equal world? What does it look like? What does it look like to empower women? What do we mean by that? So when we think about this, what do we mean? Let's discuss this. Yes, Tyler. So the question is, what do we mean by women's empowerment? What what do we mean by that? What constitutes the empowerment of women, or what are some of the dimensions of gender equality? What do we mean when we say gender equality? Let me ask the question a different way. What kinds of rights do women often lack in developing countries?
A lot of the things that women's rights lack, especially from what I saw with some of the earlier things that you were presenting in the PowerPoint, it's just a lot of basic rights of autonomy, especially I know one of the big things that's going on right now, not just in the US, but like in the entire world, is like is the rights for like an abortion and like safe and like safely acquiring one. Like I know the year like earlier in the news, like there was a European country that like struck down a law to basically allow that to happen. And a lot of this is coming from basically systematically women were set up to fail, and we're still trying to get those rights back today because there's still remnants of a lot of the ideas of like patriarchy and such. So it's an uphill battle, but it's still going on. And no matter how far ahead that you think, there's still plenty of ways to go.
Good, thank you, Daniela. Let's kind of bring together some different contributions before I engage the comments more broadly. We've got several comments in the chat, but I'd love to open up the mic to anyone who wants to take the floor.
I'm frustrated because I can only find the word in Spanish, but I don't know how to translate it to English. But basically, like allowing like both men and women to decide or give their input on a subject, and not thinking that only men know about politics and that women can't do it.
Absolutely. So like a parity, like some equality, or some like an even playing field.
Oh, is it like the idea of machismo?
Yeah, so we'll get into machismo here in a moment. And machismo is an important part of this story, especially in Latin America. When I went to Chile, machismo was one of the first words I learned, because I made a lot of good friends, and I had some women friends, and we talked a lot about machismo in Chile. And in Chile, the feminist movement is stronger than virtually anywhere else in the world. And interestingly and importantly, that's actually how they were able to secure a 50% quota for women's representation in the Constituent Assembly, But the feminist movement is extremely powerful, and one of the things they combat is the machismo, this sort of cultural of male dominance that kind of pervades Latin societies. But I want to hear from as many people as possible. We've heard from Danielle and we've heard from Karen. Can we hear from some others? What kinds of rights do women lack in countries that are still developing was the key question. So Jocelyn says bodily autonomy, absolutely, especially in Latin America. The right to an abortion is virtually non-existent with some exceptions, Uruguay being one of them. Ariana says the right to vote, absolutely, right? The most fundamental right in a democracy, the right to vote. Josette says they lack education rights. They're not able to access education, absolutely. Andrea says women having the same opportunity as men to achieve positions that have been traditionally held and reserved by men, absolutely. So women having a right to ascend to all levels of decision-making in government. And that includes the highest levels of political power, those levels reached by Bachelet and Dilma Rousseff and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. UL says having the right to vote, to own a driver's license, to own a bank account, whole autonomy on their body, not to mention the opportunity of an education and fair wages. Of course, absolutely. Samantha says, say it in Spanish, Queen. Like letting women opinar. Daniela says, all my homies hate machismo. Yeah, it incites a lot of strong reactions, and for good reason. Arturo says women of color are often discriminated against, especially women in Latin, gender inclusive for Latino countries. They are often not given the platform to fight for their struggles. Men use machismo to take away the power and suppress them from having a platform. Karen says the right to vote, absolutely. Adriana says the right to marry whomever. That's critical, of course. Cynthia agrees with Karen. And so, as Daniela and as Karen highlighted, it goes to basic rights: the right to participate, the right to vote, the right to obtain employment outside of the home, the right to make an independent income, the right to choose who you marry, or if you want to marry, the right to access reproductive services, the right to access credit, the right to leave a marriage, and so on and so forth. These are only a few of the rights that women often lack in developing countries and often in new democracies. Now, to be clear, there's a big difference between some of the most rigidly conservative societies that may be under Sharia law and, say, a new democracy in Latin America where women don't enjoy rights in practice as widely as men. There's a big difference between the experiences of some of these different countries. And so there is an important variation. But even so, generally speaking, the deck is stacked against women, even in the United States, and maybe more so in the United States than in a place like Uruguay, at least in terms of the representation of women in the legislature. The point that both Daniela and Karen made is that there's this sort of inequality, and women don't enjoy the same rights. And in Latin American countries, that often falls under the rubric of machismo, or the ways that the male dominance kind of basically stacks the deck against women and creates a situation where they can't access or exercise basic rights. And so women in Latin American countries and elsewhere in the world earn less income, have poorer health outcomes, and generally speaking, don't enjoy the same rights and privileges that men do. And so when we talk about women's empowerment and gender equality, we're talking first and foremost about things like the right to earn an independent income, to be independent economically from either a partner or whoever, the right to find employment outside the home, the right to not be domestically employed, but then also the right for your domestic labor to be valued as labor. There's an important movement in economics that seeks to sort of reconceptualize domestic labor as labor with monetary value and as labor that should be accounted for in a country's GDP or its total product, because it does have value. The point is that women's labor should be respected and they should have the right to find employment outside of the home. And it should be valued for what it is when they do work inside the home if they choose to, independently of anyone who might make that choice for them. It also means the right to have ownership rights. Can you own property, or do you have to basically leave that to the men in your family? So for example, in some countries, you can own property, but if your husband dies, that property goes to someone in the husband's family who's not you. And so your tie or your ownership right depends on the survival of your husband. That's a very, very limited ownership right. That's hardly an ownership right. But this is the reality in many places. The right to access education is not widely enjoyed by women. The right to become literate, relatedly, is not widely enjoyed by women. These are very basic rights that are not widely enjoyed. The right that is the most important for our discussion is this one, the right to participate in decision-making at all levels of government. This means the right to participate in the legislature, the executive, the bureaucracy, the PTA, the city council, the state legislature, so on and so forth. It also means the right to participate in decision-making in the home, which from an Aristotelian point of view is one level of organizational form or government, broadly speaking. And then finally, the right to access healthcare and reproductive services. This is closely tied to everything else on this list. It perhaps is the most important of all, though, because women's survival is so closely tied to their ability to access healthcare and reproductive services. Women die during childbirth at very high rates in many developing countries, in many democracies. They often die as well if they're not able to access an abortion. In many cases, they're forced to give birth despite serious, serious harm to their bodily autonomy or their health. And these are often decisions that are not made by them. Of course, they're not made by them. They're made by, of course, men or authorities who determine what the rules are about what women can access. When we talk about women's empowerment and gender equality, this is what we mean. We're fundamentally talking about rights. And rights both exist as rights, but they also have to exist in practice, right? Women have to be able to exercise that right, not just point to that right on the books and say we have it. They have to be able to exercise it as well. So when we talk about women's empowerment and gender equality, we often begin from a global point of view, a sort of international point of view. And the reason is because the United Nations is perhaps the most important organization in the international system involved in promoting women's rights. The UN has identified a number of goals and a number of categories for improvement. And they've pointed out, for example, that over the last decade, 131 countries have enacted 274 legal and regulatory reforms in support of gender equality. These often include gender quotas or certain regulations that require gender sort of sensitive public policy and governance. It means, for instance, a certain number of seats set aside for women or required to be filled by women within parties or within legislatures, candidates or candidate slates that have to be filled by a certain percentage of women for parties, and so on and so forth. It's also been shown that women and girls have become more educated and have become more literate over the last decade, even though at the global level, big gaps do persist. The maternal mortality rate has fallen significantly between 2000 and 2017 by 38%, which is a sizable decrease, but it's still is too high, 211 deaths per 100,000 live births. And these rates are the highest, of course, in countries where women cannot access reproductive services that are often essential or vital to their survival because of a threat to their life posed by childbirth. And of course, there are a variety of other categories that matter a great deal as well. And so one that we'll talk about at length today is the category of politics and political representation. 1 in 4 seats are held by women in national parliaments. That's an improvement over the situation a couple decades ago, but as you'll see in a moment, there's a lot of work left to do. In terms of establishing gender parity in the workplace, there have been improvements in terms of reducing poverty, in terms of increasing the percentage of women involved in the labor force. There's been some reduction in inequality between men and women in terms of income and pay and wages, but all of these are categories that still require more work and still need more work to be done in. And what we see when we look at this picture is we see an incomplete process of reform. We see a set of efforts underway with a set of incomplete results. I think that the UN's objective, and we should hope, is that within a few decades, these gaps can be narrowed significantly and they can become immaterial. But as of today, right now, they remain consequential, and especially because of COVID and how crises and changes in the global economy have impacted women disproportionately. Daniela says, don't forget how LGBT, especially trans women of color, suffer the most. Absolutely. And this is especially important in countries that are more sort of conservative, or that might have a more traditional mindset, or that might be more Catholic, for example. Sometimes those societies are far less accepting, and LGBT and trans women of color especially are among the most marginalized, and that's the case in this country as well. And so the deck is stacked against women in general, but especially against women of color and LGBT and trans women. So thank you, Daniela, for pointing that out. Cynthia says, women lack the decision-making at private and public levels and access to resources, productive and reproductive life. Absolutely, Cynthia. And this is the set of issues that we're discussing a lot today. And that point you make about representation in decision-making is really, really important, because it gets to political power and whether women are allowed to participate in the system of political power and whether they benefit from public policy. Now, the question arises, well, what happens when women are elected? If one of the objectives is to establish the right of women to participate in decision-making and to increase their representation, what happens when they are elected in larger numbers, and what kinds of outcomes do we get? I want us to think about this question, and I want you to think about how women affect politics and how incorporating more women into politics and into institutions of government will change the government and how it might change politics. We're going to return to that question in just a moment, but let's watch a video that puts this in perspective for us. Now, this is a video about the US, but I think that it's equally relevant because it talks about some general issues that are applicable to really all countries.
The 2018 midterms were huge for women candidates. In Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn became the state's first woman senator. Over in Massachusetts, Ayanna Pressley is the first African-American woman elected to the House from any state in New England. In Maine, voters chose Janet Mills to be the state's first woman governor. Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland became the first Native American women elected to Congress. A total of 273 women were on the ballot in the 2018 midterms, representing both parties. Now compare that to the past 5 elections. That's a big jump in women candidates vying for office. So women must be pretty well represented in the US government now, right? Not exactly. The share of women in the House and Senate has increased over time, but it's still well below the share of women in the US population. And if you dig deeper, Congress looks even less representative. Women of color make up 18% of the US population, but before the 2018 midterms, they accounted for just 7% of Congress. And LGBT women make up about 2.5% of the US population. But there are only 2 openly LGBT women in Congress. That's less than 1%. Even with the recent wins by women candidates in the 2018 midterms, there's still a long way to go before they're fully represented. And this underrepresentation can have very real policy consequences. Take a look at this chart, showing what 2018 congressional candidates spent time talking about. Women were much more likely than men to discuss issues like education, climate change, and minimum wage. There's even evidence that women make better lawmakers. One study found that female lawmakers bring in 9% more federal spending for their constituents than their male counterparts. And that's on top of the fact that women lawmakers sponsor more bills than male legislators. This success might actually help explain why women are less likely to run for office than men in the first place. Many women underestimate their qualifications and perceive gender bias among voters, which discourages them from running. Because of these hurdles, only the most talented and ambitious women seek office. While there's still more room for growth for women to be accurately represented in government, there's evidence to show that the more women are elected, the more they inspire other women to run. One study found that if a state elected a woman senator or governor, an average of 7 additional women would run for state government in the following election cycle. These women who were elected during the 2018 midterms will help inspire other women to run for office in the future. And as more women join government, their representation will become more and more normalized. And eventually, a video like this won't even be necessary.
So far we've talked about women's empowerment and gender equality, and we talked about the political dimension in part, and how expanding and promoting women's representation is part of this picture. This video is interesting because it shows us what happens when women are actually elected and when they are represented and when they do become part of politics and decision making. And so let's use this as an example, and let's draw from this and discuss this for a moment. What happens when women are elected? What is the result? This can be something that you picked up from the video, or it can be something that is intuitive, or that you have as an insight. So what happens when women are elected? How does that affect politics?
It allows for other women to see that they have a chance of getting elected as well and convincing them to run for office.
Okay, so in the first place, there's a demonstration effect. That's what we call that. A demonstration effect is when people see someone do something that's not normally done, and it inspires them to do it because they now believe that it's more doable than before. So they go and they do it. And the point in this video, in part, was that when one woman runs, and if she is elected, she's very likely to inspire many more to run in subsequent elections. And so there's this kind of snowballing that takes place. And that's important because it means that once you can get your foot in the door, it's easier to sort of get that door open later on. And that means then that women can have a way in, even when it seems difficult, if not impossible, to penetrate some of those institutions that the men built, so to speak. What else happens when women are elected?
I think there will be different angles towards like policies or like towards solutions for some kind of policy problem, because someone once told me I wouldn't want a woman president because they'll be more sympathetic towards like criminals, for example. And I just thought like, but is that necessarily bad? Like, there's lots of reasons to go towards a subject like that. So it's like maybe this woman will bring a different perspective than a current male uh, uh, politician who's handling those kinds of subjects. Like maybe a woman will bring in a different perspective, and maybe it could be better.
Yeah, that example that you give is a good one, right? It's sort of like the difference between like a punitive approach to like criminal justice and like a more rehabilitative approach or a developmental approach or an integrative approach where you treat the person as a whole person, right? And you address what's missing in their life as opposed to punishing them for what they did in excess. And we saw this in the video. In Karen's example is a really good one. Women candidates and politicians tend to talk much more about issues like minimum wage, social security, climate change, these kinds of survival issues that frankly, if you're like me, you can really relate to. I'm from a working class family, and these issues matter to me, and I think that they matter to many of you as well. And so, yeah, I feel like, a woman talking about those issues is much more representative of me than, some elite white guy who goes up there and represents credit card companies. I'd much rather see politicians talk about minimum wage and survival issues. This is one of the ways that women affect politics, but they're also more effective politicians because not only did they talk more about minimum wage, social security, survival issues, but they also bring more money home to their constituents in terms of federal spending. And so they are effective politically, they are effective in government, but they're often different in terms of their effectiveness in their politics. And so a woman elected is going to often be different than a man elected. And that's one point that comes from this discussion that's interesting, but maybe sometimes controversial as well, because let me admit myself that, I often didn't want to say that there were like these fundamental differences between men and women, on the idea that everyone's equal and we're all the same, right? But if women are promoting these issues of social security and minimum wage and climate change more than men are, that's clearly an important difference, right? And that goes to something about women candidates and women politicians that we might not have known had they not been elected in larger numbers. And so there's something important here. And I think that the point is we stand to potentially be healthier, happier, better off, and richer if more women are elected. And that's sort of the takeaway from this video. Does anyone disagree with that? Or does anyone want to say more about what would happen if more women are elected?
Well, the first thing that came to mind was, from the social programs that you listed and, climate change, of course, if the more they talk about it, I feel like the more it'll be brought to the national agenda, and maybe their male counterparts will take up the discussion too, and maybe move the needle towards more reforms or more policy in that direction.
Totally. And especially if these women politicians have some leverage, right? Or if they've got, if they're strong bargainers, if they can horse trade, and if they can support, some male politicians' legislation in exchange for him supporting hers or championing her issue. And so one example I think of is AOC. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is a fantastic politician. She's very effective, and she's an example of this kind of like bargainer, this horse trader, who's been effective at kind of moving the needle and getting some of her colleagues, her male colleagues, to take up the issues that she cares more about. Okay, so what we see here then is that women's empowerment matters because it changes politics and it has a material impact on the lives of ordinary people because of the differences often between the priorities of men and women and the way that men and women in politics pursue different kinds of policies. Now, when we accept the importance of women's empowerment and think about what brings about that empowerment, we have to start thinking about, well, what are the kinds of changes to the system that could facilitate the increased representation of women? How do we get more women in office? How do we get them in positions of power within organizations, within legislatures? And what we've found out is that the single most important component are legal reforms that basically function as quotas. Quotas for the selection of female candidates to political office. And these are really, really common. Since 1995, more than 100 countries have adopted them, and they've been implemented all over the world, often very, very effectively and successfully. There are three types of these legal reforms that facilitate increased women's representation and that contribute to this women's empowerment. The first one is what we call reserved seats. These set aside a certain number of places for women. In Latin American countries right now, the standard or the benchmark is about 50%. For example, in 2021 in Peru, at the elections, the new standard or the new reserved seat quota will be 50%. But it's already 50% in some other places, I believe including Argentina. These reserved seat quotas are especially important because it means that a certain number of seats are set aside and they have to be filled by women. And that's a powerful tool if traditionally the system has worked to exclude them from the system. The second type of legal reform is a party quota. And this is a quota that seeks to increase the proportion of women among party candidates. Now, whereas a reserved seat quota is often applied to a legislature or some, organization within the government, a party quota is a policy or a rule imposed by a government that affects the individual political parties within the system. So it's like a rule that says you have to have this proportion of your candidates women. You have to have so many women in et cetera. So for instance, if Uruguay sets a party quota of 50%, well, the Colorado party will have to make sure that 50% of its candidates are women. And I don't know if Uruguay has a party quota, but party quotas are more common in, say, Africa, including in South Africa. And we'll talk about the South African case in a moment. Finally, we have legislative quotas. These require all of the political parties to nominate a certain percentage of women on their electoral slates. This basically means that parties have to nominate a certain percentage of women whenever they try to seek office. Legislative quotas are similar to party quotas, but they work a little bit differently. So one of the interesting things about gender equality in democracy is that the poster child for expanding gender equality is Rwanda. And that's an interesting fact. You might not have expected that. More generally, in Africa, gender quotas have been very effective and have been very common. And women's representation in African democracies is much better than it is in many other places in the world. And this might surprise us because these we might think of as more traditional societies, but part of the story relates to an aggressive promotion of gender quotas. And the example of Rwanda is one example that puts this in perspective. So in Rwanda, in 2006, women had 48.8% of the seats in the lower house of the parliament. That's astounding. That's fantastic. What's the story behind that? Well, the story is that Rwanda implemented a system of reserved seats after the 1994 genocide. And after that terrible event, which caused Tutsis to become exiled and to concentrate in Uganda, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a Tutsi-dominated party, came to power, and it pressed very aggressively for a 30% quota. And this was enshrined in the 2003 Constitution, and it was inspired by their experience in Uganda, which had had a quota since 1989. Rwanda also used that occasion to create a triple ballot and women's councils. So you have an example in Rwanda that demonstrates the capacity of these rules, these quotas, to facilitate the representation of women at a very high level of government and in other institutions as well. Now, Rwanda was also inspired by South Africa, which has an extensive system of gender quotas as well. And the case of South Africa is notable because the African National Congress, which is South Africa's most sort of infamous political party, adopted a 30% party quota in 1994. You know what, everyone? I told you previously that party quotas were implemented or imposed by governments. They're actually not. I take that back. They're imposed by parties. Parties themselves make those decisions. Excuse me. Small correction. I regret the error. But the African National Congress is an excellent example of a very, very progressive party from the perspective of gender equality. Now, it has its critics, of course, and if you Google ANC, in gender equality, you'll find cartoons that make fun of the party and refer to the way in which they use lip service to pander to women. But make no mistake, they have a high threshold, or at least a threshold, or a quota, a party quota for the representation of women in the party, and that was 30%, adopted in 1994. I don't know if it's increased since then, but that was at least what they put in place then. Now, a legislative quota, on the other hand, is a rule imposed by the government about what percentage of the parliament or the Congress must be women. And so these legislative quotas are especially common in Latin America. They are most common in Latin America. Except Guatemala and Venezuela, these are countries that don't have them. In Latin America, the beginning stages saw thresholds of about 20% or 30%. 20% or 30% of seats would be filled by women, but the new standard is really 50%. And Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Panama all require gender balancing among legislative candidates. And so that means then that there has to be a 50-50 balance, men and women. And this is one of the things about Latin American countries that makes them rather progressive compared to the United States, whereas we just saw representation of women is still abysmal, despite some increases and some improvements over the years. Latin American countries have been often at the forefront of this movement to institute these quotas. Interestingly, these quotas haven't always coincided with the expansion of other women's rights. We saw, for instance, that in Argentina, the Senate narrowly rejected a bill to legalize abortion. Gender balancing didn't appear to have a positive impact in that case, or at least wasn't enough to carry the pro-reform coalition to victory in the case of abortion in Argentina. There's a really good quote from 1997 from Congresswoman Luz Salgado. When she introduced Peru's law, she said the following: "A patriarchal and machista political culture is responsible for the fact that of 2013 parliamentarians, only 84 have been women." Now, that's a staggering number. Only 84 have been women. And Luz Salgado introduced Peru's law, which is still on the books, although, as I did mention, beginning in 2021, the percentage has increased to 50%. So there has been some modification since 97, but it began for this reason, as highlighted by this quote. Latin America then is on the forefront. Latin America sets itself apart from other places, and really Latin America is doing much better than the United States in this regard, and it's because of these quotas, these quotas. Now, the question arises, why are these gender quotas adopted? What is the main driver of these quotas? If these quotas matter so much, if they carry the potential to improve representation and put women in positions of power, why are they adopted? How do we understand the emergence of these things? Well, there are four sort of perspectives on these gender quotas. The first one emphasizes women and their capacity to mobilize and to come together to pressure lawmakers to adopt these quotas. The example of Chile would be a really good example. I just gave you the example of the Constituent Assembly. The feminist movement pressured successfully to get a 50-50 gender balanced Constituent Assembly. And that Constituent Assembly will be elected in coming elections, but it will be 50% women and 50% men. And that's primarily a result of the successful mobilization of the feminist movement in Chile. And so that's one example of women mobilizing for a quota. The second perspective emphasizes the behavior of politicians who are seen as strategic and willing to decide for themselves without being pressured by feminists and women's movements to support quotas for strategic reasons. The idea that, look, women are half the population, why not incorporate them more aggressively and get their support politically for my reelection? This is the idea behind this perspective. Some might say that the ANC is an example of politicians or a party recognizing the strategic advantage for supporting quotas. Number three, quotas align with existing notions of equality and representation. This focuses on ideas. This perspective emphasizes ideas of equality and equity and how these support the adoption of these quotas. It's the force of the idea of equality itself that forces the adoption of quotas. And then fourth, quotas are supported by global norms and they spread transnationally. This is an argument that emphasizes diffusion. The idea is that countries adopt gender quotas when countries around them have previously adopted gender quotas. And they adopt these quotas, and then other countries adopt these quotas, and then other countries adopt them. And there's this diffusion and this transnational spread of these quotas. This is why countries adopt them. They're following a logic of appropriateness. These are four different perspectives, and those four different perspectives we'll see again when we do our case studies on Wednesday. We'll do much more detailed studies of Uruguay in some different cases, and we'll take a look specifically through the lenses of those different perspectives, and we'll try to think about the reasons that these quotas are adopted. But before we get to Wednesday, I'd like us to take a step back and begin to address some questions that arise in this discussion. One of the questions that comes out of this discussion is whether elites or masses cause the adoption of gender quotas. Remember that in democratization studies, we have a few different approaches. One of those approaches focuses on elites and their calculations and their strategic behavior. From the perspective of that theory, gender quotas would be adopted by elites who choose strategically to adopt them. On the other hand, we also saw the social forces tradition, or the sort of mass protest tradition, where social mobilization causes change. From the perspective of that theory, it's masses and ordinary people, groups of people, who cause the adoption of gender quotas. And so I want to ask you, do you think quotas are more likely to be adopted or to be effective when they result from elites or from masses? Which actor do you think is more important in the adoption of these quotas? What do you think? Do elites or do masses cause the adoption of gender quotas?
I think it's more elite driven because, in a way, the masses choose the candidates that the elites select. So, in the examples that were shown, at least in the beginning, prior to the Latin American ones, it was demonstrating that the parties have control over supporting the quotas that they thought were more successful to their election. So, I feel like protests for quotas could just get replaced by the elites then having the decision to run more female candidates.
Okay, okay. So it could be that, you know, these protesters certainly articulate a position. Maybe the articulation of that position helps the elites to recognize what might be a strategic choice, but it's ultimately going to be those elites who make that choice, and maybe they're invulnerable to those masses. Now, the example of Argentina is interesting, right? Because, you know, those big protests in support of the abortion access law didn't appear to move the needle, right? At least in terms of that outcome, right? It's not the same. They weren't adopting a gender quota, but it was an outcome that bared on the rights and the privileges of women. And so in that case, the elites appeared to be divorced from the masses, or there didn't appear to be a role for the masses. But does anyone think that maybe there's a role for the masses that we're missing here? Well, I think that the example of Chile supports the masses perspective, because the case of Chile, as I mentioned, shows how very strong feminist movements can obtain gender quotas for constituent assemblies involved in the rewriting of constitutions. That's heavy. That's big. That's really big. So that's definitely one for the masses, without a doubt. And feminist movements in Chile are not the only groups in Chile who have serious power. We saw that student movements are very effective as well. So look, it can be elites, it can be masses, it might be both elites and masses. But I want you to think carefully about this, and I want you to be willing to return to this question, because remember that our perspectives, our approaches to democratization studies are theoretical perspectives that we should be able to use in any of these different situations, right? We should be able to analyze gender quota adoption as an example of a democratic reform that could be caused by any number of different factors. I want to address a second question, and I'd like to generate more engagement. And so I hope that more of you will feel comfortable commenting, because these are questions that help to tie together the issues in the course. And it's important that we use this as an opportunity to think in an integrative way. Okay, so The second thing I want to ask you is, how do democratic transitions affect quota adoption? Do you think the quota adoption is more likely during a democratic transition, or do you think that there needs to be a long period of political stability before those quotas are adopted? And why?
I think that in moments where there's political instability, there's more leverage for a group that makes up a majority of the population to force quotas into the agenda or make it so that they're at least a consideration by the major parties. Whereas if there's a lot of political stability and the countries really have no incentive to change their structure, there's no reason to adopt quotas on a system that's already running.
Okay, so maybe a transition creates opportunities for groups with more leverage or larger groups to sort of push their weight around. Absolutely. And the example of Rwanda is interesting because that's kind of like a regime transition, or at least a transition from conflict to peace. During that transition, and sort of in the short aftermath when the RPF came to power, they used that window of opportunity to push through quotas. And so they did use the transition in that case. And that was an example of an opening that they leveraged to create that reform. But you can also consider the possibility that political stability might also create opportunities. Can anyone think about why that might be the case? So I can think of a reason. If you're a politician or a political party, how do you win office? How do you win office if you're a politician? Giovanni says by getting votes. Yoel says campaigning. All right. Who votes? Who votes? Do women vote? So they may vote less than men, but they vote. They vote. And the point that I want to make is that during periods of political stability, so those periods that come after the democratic transition, that period of kind of gestation, those are periods when patterns of competition get locked in and parties begin to kind of spin their wheels, so to speak. It gets harder for them to get new voters. It gets harder for them to get a leg up on the competition. And in that stable environment where everything is kind of reproducing itself and there's no change, parties and politicians begin to seek out ways of getting strategic advantages and getting a leg up on their rivals, either another political party or another politician or whatever. One way of doing that is by expanding your constituency or by expanding the electorate or by creating policies that can help to enhance the position of a group who might vote for you. And so if you're a politician, locked in a fight with, your competitors, you might see an incentive, a reason to adopt or push for a gender quota, since that would benefit women and improve the representation of women. You might get more votes that way. And so those competitive pressures that arise during periods of political stability can also create opportunities for quota adoption, in the same way that transitions also can, by loosening the constraints and the restrictions on action temporarily, and by creating opportunities for groups with leverage and size to push their weight around. These are questions that I recognize are challenging questions, but as we come to the end of the semester, these are questions that we should be able to address, because these require us to put together the different themes and issues from the course and to think creatively in ways that we've already been doing on the assignments. The last question that we need to address, or at least consider, is the question of whether the origins of quota policies matter, and specifically whether the international origins of these policies matter. If a policy comes from outside, if the influence or the inspiration for the policy comes from somewhere else, is that policy less likely to have an impact than if it was a policy that was put in place domestically and came from inside? If you adopt or are influenced by some other country, does that make the policy more feeble, or does that weaken the policy? Is it less likely to bring about the intended outcome? It's a possibility. What we've seen is that the diffusion of processes and policies doesn't necessarily guarantee the effectiveness of those processes and policies, for reasons that you could imagine. Different countries have different circumstances, but there's also the possibility that the international origin of them makes them less effective as well, because they weren't a product of the domestic environment. And so bringing this all together, the big picture is one of this international system with the UN at its center as an international organization that prioritizes and values women's empowerment and gender equality. We see the sort of diffusion of this policy and this value from country to country. We see increases in women's representation. We see improvements in women's representation. But we also have a number of questions about whether democratic transitions affect gender quota adoption and representation of women, whether political stability is more important. And we have questions about whether elites or masses are primarily responsible for these outcomes. These are questions that we'll think about more on Wednesday. But thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and I'll see you next time.